All right, so this is the February MEC Minute, and as our guest speaker today is Ginger Workman, EMS Coordinator for West Lincoln Fire District, and she's going to talk about her experience with the federal DMAT program. Ginger, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Looking at the NDMS and DMAT, which are, as we know, the federal government is notorious for acronyms as much as the fire service is. But looking at it from what I perceive as a new hire perspective. So when we look at NDMS is the National Disaster Medical System, and then DMAT is the Disaster Medical Assistance Teams. So the DMAT team is actually parts embedded in with NDMS. So we're just going to go over some things on as far as how we're deployed and some of the different deployments that we've done. I know for me as a new hire coming into it, have been quite impressed at the wide range of activities and potential deployments that we've had.
So you've been at this for less than a year?
Yes, very much so. 2 years to get hired in and less than a year on the team.
And you've already had one deployment?
Yes, correct. One actual deployment, and then we had one training deployment.
Okay. So a lot of this is going to be discussion about your on-scene experience having been deployed to Florida.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So we're looking at, and that would have been most recently Hurricane Ian. We literally spent 10 days in a parking lot. So we'll have more pictures to follow and a little more about what we did in that regards and what a lot of the other teams that were around us did as well. So first looking at it, and there's only a couple wordy slides, so we're going to get them out of the way early. The DMAT teams, there's actually 55 DMATs across the country. So not every state has a DMAT, and some states have several DMATs. Ohio actually has two. They have OH1, which is in the Toledo area, which is the team that I'm affiliated with, and there is OH5, which is over around the Dayton, Cincinnati area. The reason that there's 1 and 5, in case any of you are curious, is before the federal government did some consolidation restructuring, Ohio actually had 6 teams at one time. Northern Ohio had 4 teams. Basically, each hospital had their own DMAT team. And then the 5 was down, and then 6 was over closer to the Pennsylvania border. So when they restructured, basically 1 through 4 all merged together to become OH1. So as Ohio has 2 teams, as we know, if anyone's ever watched any of the federal responses or different things, just like we look for the task force identifications, we know that Florida has several teams, California, New York. So, but we all work together, pairing up to be able to do our deployments. So who makes up a DMAT team? Who are those players? So the players are physicians and also that become our medical officers, our advanced clinicians. It's respiratory therapists, it's pharmacists, it's paramedics, it's safety specialists, because like everything else, safety, logisticals. There's a lot of logistics involved in doing a federal team deployment. And then our informational technology. This is patient care. We're out in the medical world, so HIPAA applies. We've got to be able to have patient care reporting. We've got to be able to track our patients to know where they're going. And then communications and administrative specialists. There are people there. We have bean counters that come with us. As much as we're on the ground, there's still receipts to keep track of. There's still a huge financial perspective of it, the planning part of it, and then even with communications. We actually have a team that travels with us and builds our own little mini base stations. So we use Mark's radios, and they come in, we put little towers up, and the whole perspective of, when you think of it, is basically we're going in with as much of a zero footprint as far as needing outside resources. So what do? There's a wide range of things. We do anything from triage, general emergency care, general medical care. We also, through COVID especially, at different times, mass prophylaxis. They did a lot of vaccine clinics, a lot of COVID response, and it may be something where we have a facility where we need to evacuate the hospital. So we're able to come in and be able to help facilitate those patient movements on a huge scale. We'll talk more about the hospital decompression in a few other slides. This is the last of the wordy ones. So when we look at the NIMS, all those, I kind of chuckled when I first got involved with it, because as much as I thought I knew NIMS and ICS, it really starts to make sense on a much bigger scale when we deploy federally. Our teams actually are deployed through the Office of Health and Human Services, and within that office now is the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness Response, more known for us as ASPR. So basically, depending on the responses that the states make, so that this still comes up through the governor of the state, makes the request at the federal level, and then they go through. NDMS has been very fortunate here recently to actually be upgraded to its own operational division. which for the most part, what's that translate to? It translates to us being able to be deployed faster and more streamlined process, instead of us kind of being a asset that they look down and it's like, oh yeah, well, let's go ahead and we'll pull them. Now we actually have an operational division. And then we go through, for those of you that understand the National Response Framework, we're considered ESF 8s, which when you look, there's multiple different ESFs as far as what resources need pulled. So we usually come in with an ESF 8, if anyone's, for those of you that are familiar with how that framework plays out. So when we start looking at what's involved with it, the slide, basically now we're down to more of our pictures. So the planning and the IMT, these pictures, one of the things that I've learned very quickly with when we deploy, we are able to take pictures and we're able to do pictures, but we go into a social media blackout. There's no one posting. We basically go dark to anything social media related as far as where we're at in pictures. All of our pictures are cleared through Health and Human Services and ASPR before any of them are posted. So the pictures you're going to see, some of them are ones from my deployment, but others are ones that have been vetted through HHS, but give an overview of what all goes on with it. So from the planning perspective, these are different areas that we're looking at. Some of them are done out of DC, others are hotel conference rooms, planning centers, SOCs across the country, depending on what's going on. And at this point, how many things are going on. Right now, there's multiple different sets of SOCs up and IMTs in place because, as we know, looking at the media, we've got an active volcano, going on in Hawaii. California is seeing record rainfall. We still have a COVID response. There's still monkeypox is still on the radar, Ebola. So multiple different things that we don't even think about that all involve where there may be groups working behind the scenes, keeping an eye on where we need resources. The other thing we're looking at is with the RSV season hitting early, bringing in nursing staff and clinicians to be able to help backfill the hospitals and to be able to help to decompress them as they're seeing increased patient loads. So one of the neat things with the picture on the top right, the gentleman in that top right picture in the green was actually, I laughed when I saw the picture because he actually is part of the U.S. Marshals, and he was one of the marshals that actually did our escorts from Atlanta to Florida for a recent deployment. So it's kind of neat to think that he's actually was involved in the planning process of being able to get all of us as federal assets down to our location where we needed to be. Our next one we look at is what we call just-in-time training. So they bring us in, we knew we were getting deployed, so we end up in a hotel just outside of Atlanta Airport. And actually when I say we, there is I think 4 or 5 teams at least that were all there, and we all deployed differently depending on where our teams were going and what our team makeup was as far as where we were going. So what we do is all of our equipment that's shipped to us in what we call caches, we get that equipment out, and that's a good chance for us to go over the ventilator. We use Zoll ventilators. So we want to be able to go over that ventilator and get familiar with it. We want to go through our MLK, which is a multiple life-saving kit, which has a lot of our meds and our treatments, IV pumps, and things of that nature. So we get that time to be able to get familiar with it before we're actually using it. Because in some cases, it may have been a while. Hurricane Ian was the first natural disaster deployment that anyone had done in several years because everything had been a COVID deployment. The COVID deployments were basically everyone would stay in a hospital or in a hotel, and then they would go to the hospital to go to work. So we didn't have any of these caches because we were using the hospital's resources. We basically were human assets more so than human and equipment assets. The other one at the bottom is fit testing. I've been on the team not even a year yet, and I can tell you that I get it when they say we fit test all the time. So the picture of the fit testing, that's one of several of where they get us fit tested for our masks, because with the federal government, just because we had a duck bill N95 on this trip, then it may very well be something completely different on the next deployment or even going to the next base of operations. So this was one I thought puts in a pretty significant perspective. There's multiple warehouses across the country, and the picture on the left is one of the warehouses basically full with all the resources and the caches there. And then this is one from a handful of years ago with Hurricane Matthew, and it shows basically the empty racks of where those resources went. So those resources are either put into box trucks, and multiple box trucks are sent for Hurricane Ian. They sent them in 53-foot trailers, so basically semi-trailers unloaded. The downfall we found with a semi-trailer is everything fits in one box, but invariably what you need is at the front of the trailer, so everything has to come off first to be able to start setting assets up. So that became quite interesting. Logistics, when we land somewhere, we've got to be able to function. So you can see we've got generators, and with the generators, the gentleman you see looking at the generator, very easily those are going to be clinicians as well, because when we land, you don't get there, and I don't get there and say, well, I'm a nurse, I do nursing functions. No, I help set the tents up, learn the generators, and learn how we've all got to be able to be semper gumby is a big term we use a lot. And then also we've got to be able to be adaptable and truly use all of our skill sets that we've developed over our lifetime to be able to be an integral part of the team. Getting there, we travel. There isn't a motorcade or anything where we travel. They bring us all in. We fly commercial airline. And then they usually have a series of rental cars. And believe it or not, they can probably still stuff 5 or 6 people into the rental car on the bottom left. So when we talk about having an advanced team, like, okay, so we've got all these logistics, all these caches that we're sending. It's like, all right, so they're going to go, we're going to get there, and then we just start seeing patients. That's not at all how it works. I knew that going into it, and I was super excited about it because I feel like it fits my personality well. But one of the things, that bottom right picture, it's not ours. Wasn't our site. But one of the things you'll notice, it's dusk. And the tent on the left-hand side of that picture is not set up by a long shot. So what happened with us was we traveled 8 hours. We were every bit of an 8-hour day of travel. We landed at dark, and the first thing that we were told from our team commander was, get your headlamps, your boots, and your gloves. We're going to work. So we literally landed on the ground. I'll show you what our base of operations looks like in a few slides to get a better perspective of how many tents we had to get set up before. They told us when we got there, we want to start seeing patients at noon the next day. So we had about 15 hours to be able to get enough of our tents up to be able to start seeing patients. These are some of the other pictures. Basically, the one on the left is actually our corridor in between all of our tents, where we have, each tent has its own HVAC system. So, and again, there isn't an HVAC team. There's not plumbers and different ones that travel with us. It's a matter of us being able to set everything up. The bladders on the sides that you see there at the bottom, we're in a parking lot. Most people with their parking lots, even though they're experiencing a natural disaster, frown upon people driving stakes through their parking lot to be able to secure tents. So we actually have water bladders that we use to be able to secure the tents. So in the event of wind or inclement weather conditions, our tents, the goal is for them to stay where we put them.
So that's not potable water?
No, that is not potable water at all.
Okay. Probably good shower water. Probably gets hot.
Yes, it does. Yeah, we actually have similar bladders that we had for our showers, and they actually were able to turn the water heaters off, because the one thing they told us they found out with especially southern deployments, or tropical deployments, if you would, is that they can heat the water up, but they have no way to cool the water down. And at one point, the water was so hot, it was hard for anyone to even get a shower without risking receiving burns.
Yeah, we worry about cold showers.
Exactly, yeah. Cold shower, everyone's terrified of a cold shower, and I'm like, who would have ever thought an equally hot shower is just as miserable? And I learned the term of like a Navy shower, where we get in the shower, if you're one that likes to turn it on, let the water get hot. No, you have basically, you turn the water on, you get wet, you soap up, you turn the water back on, and it's literally a series of off and on, off and on.
So what's the top right on that slide? So
the top right on this slide is actually, everyone was super excited about it, and of course me being new to the team, I was super excited about all of it. Those are the new, some of the newer cots that they have, that actually where the head is able to sit up. So we actually can put a patient into semi-Fowler's or high Fowler's position, where normally the patient would have to lay flat. Like, you basically had one option and it was flat. So they were able to now have the cots. The one thing you'll notice is, you're like, those look kind of high. Yes, they are kind of high. You have your frail little 4'9" person. You're actually helping them up onto the cot for us to be able to treat them. And then the bottom picture is putting together the cots that we actually sleep on. So, or we can use for overflow for patients.
So the top right is your version of a hospital gurney?
Yes, that would be the hospital gurney, correct.
With no wheels?
No wheels.
Okay.
Yeah, no wheels, and somewhat tippy if you're not super careful. Yes. It's one that you're not kind of like, you don't unlock it and try to move it around at all once your patient's on it. You're pretty much, we get it set up and we're situated. So now we take those hospital gurneys. Now basically those are the same gurneys. They're just covered with not a sterile drape, like a waterproof drape. So for our patients, and then we change those out in between all of our patients. The one thing on that top left picture was kind of nice. These 3 pictures are actually from our, what we call BOO, or base of operations. So the top left is our yellow tent, and then the center one was our green tent. And then the picture on the top right is actually is our pharmacist. So the pharmacy has its own tent. We carry everything from acetaminophen to propofol, the entire gamut. So with our base of operations, along with coming in with fentanyl, ketamine, and a host of other medications, it also came with border security. So we had perimeter control for anyone that was coming in and out of our base of operations for security purposes. Our pharmacist, she was actually our day shift pharmacist. She actually flew in from Hawaii. She's been on Ohio's team and lives in Hawaii, so she flew from Hawaii to Florida to be able to do a deployment with us. Our other one is actually, our night shift one is based out of here in Columbus. So, but the tents basically kind of give you an idea. With our yellow tent, those are, again, what you would think of when you look at normal triaging. And the green, you actually see it's folding chairs. So those patients are basically kind of our treating streets, and then with our yellow tent and then our red tent, a similar setup, just with more equipment. We actually have a resuscitation bay that we build to where we're actually able to do a full cardiac arrest, and the system, it can be expanded upon. If we would have ended up seeing patients that needed surgery or needed critical care, we actually can deploy. For those of you that are familiar with the TV show MASH, other than everybody probably smoking cigarettes in the tents and just going from bloody glove to bloody glove, basically that same concept where they can set up an OR suite to be able to do surgery and then move those patients to a recovery area. So the expandability and the scalability is pretty impressive. So we're living in a parking lot for a week. The picture on the left is one from previous deployments, but that's one of the pharmacists literally sleeping underneath the pharmacy table. You learn to get sleep when you can. The other one was actually our night shift tent. There was 12 of us that slept in those accommodations. The one thing we found was that during the day, you learn to sleep very well through those conditions, because we were on a very busy intersection in Northport, Florida. The fire station was about a mile up the road, and they do about 6,000 calls a year when they're not facing the heels of a hurricane. So, but basically just kind of making the most of our situations that we're in. So now let's look kind of at a bigger scale of what we do. Scalability. Part of Ohio's team, before I got on the team, they actually were at the Superdome, and they've done a lot of our team members have done some pretty impressive and very long-reaching deployments. So this is just kind of giving you an idea that next time you're at a Superdome, now all of a sudden think of it as, okay, so now how do we treat hundreds, even thousands of patients, or set up shelters? The one on the left, actually, with where they're at, that's a special needs shelter. So they even had it set up to where once we identify the needs of the community, we can basically kind of put those resources in place. And so that shelter alone was basically all special needs focused for that area, for that community. So we know that we may have those different types. You've got to know, just like we look at risk reduction in our own communities, we need to be able to look when they go in, as far as when they're putting us in the ground. What things do we need? Do we need interpreters? Are we going into an area where English is not the first spoken language? So it doesn't make sense to send a bunch of us in that don't speak any other language without sending interpreters in with us, and things of that nature. The bottom right picture is one of the mass vaccination clinics, and they had similar ones where they did with testing, where they literally had 6-7 lanes of traffic and being able to organize it. So for those of us any of us that went through Mount Carmel's clinics and their drive-throughs, just imagine that on a much bigger scale with some of those areas that we saw. All right, so now let's look at kind of some of the other and more of the nuts and bolts of what we get into. We have what we call a lot of times decompression, augmentation, or standalone. So like the decompression is basically where the hospital is just seeing a lot of extra patients, and they're needing to be able just to get some breathing room. So it might be something where all the patients go into triage. They go in through the ER doors, they go to triage, and the triage at the hospital looks at the patient and was like, yeah, okay, they meet the criteria to go out, to come to us, go to NDMS. So then they will triage them at the hospital, and then the hospital will sort them out there, whether they send them to NDMS or whether we say, you know what, yeah, we're going to keep them here in the ER. So that could be something where we basically think of it like as a little pop-up urgent care, if you would, or a pop-up standalone, where they may send those patients that can be managed there, and then they're going to keep the critical patients and things of that nature. And augmentation might be something where, like with someone we're seeing with COVID, where it's like we're down to where we have half of our staff. We need people, so we come in and we basically help with that, with the emergency department and those different areas as far as what we're able to do. And then that standalone, and we'll go more in depth on that bottom center picture on the next slide. Is a standalone is literally, that is a parking lot in Northport, Florida. It's at Tamiami Trail, and the little pond that is to the north of it is not usually there. That was one from their residual flooding, but that was where we worked out of where we worked and operated for 10 days. So looking at this first picture, the bottom inset picture is we basically went in and then we became a resource for Northport Fire Rescue. For those of you that are not familiar with Florida, rescue in Florida and in the southern parts of the country, rescue is their medic. So as much as we say fire and EMS, their fire and rescue is their EMS. So what we did was we had a liaison from Northport with us all the time that had one of the radios for comms. So as Northport would take a 911 call, they would take the 911 call, and then they would basically call into the liaison, would give our clinicians and what we call our mid-levels report on the patient. And then based on that report, if it was a critical patient, we had a medevac sitting up at the fire station for at least 3 days while we were there. And if it was somebody that was critical, then we'd say, get them to medevac. So they'd get them up to medevac and then transfer them either to Sarasota, Bradenton, as those different places started becoming available. As just hospitals, because Northport lost their hospital in the process of the hurricane. They kept saying, we're going to open in this day, and then that kept getting pushed back. It still was not open as of the time we actually left Florida. So Northport would basically come in. So we received their 911 patients. So for a lot of us that all were EMS-minded or emergency room-based, it was kind of fun because it was almost like a normal for us. It was just a matter of, instead of being in a brick-and-mortar hospital, we're seeing the same crews every 3 days, and being able to receive their patients. The nice thing about it is Northport never had to leave Northport. Those resources for those crews were able to stay in the community that they serve instead of having a 1 to 2 hour transport time. Because what we did was, with those federal resources, they brought in either private company EMS or contract EMS. So at any given time, we would have anywhere between 3 and 8 EMS vehicles sitting in that parking lot with us. And what they would do is Northport would bring us the patient, and if they needed transferred, we would take them out of Northport's truck, move them into another vehicle, and that vehicle then made the transport. Some of our medics on a couple of our critical patients, we had a patient that walked in, literally, gentleman had come in at the end of the day, hypertensive, and ended up, the medic that went with him literally watched his stroke progress by watching just his facial droop. So fortunately, we were able to get him out and get him to where he needed to be. And one of our medics actually went with him on that transfer. Had other patients that would come in. A couple of the other crews, they delivered a baby during the storm, and a handful of other different things. So just kind of a neat concept, being able to keep the resources in the community, because Northport was extremely grateful, because now we're keeping crews that know that area in their area, and we were able to kind of take the slack off for them. So the first one we see the arrow pop up, that was our triage tent. So the way our base of operations was set up was all of our patients, our intake was started there. So that was our intake. We basically had triage, no different than what you would see at the hospital triage. There's somebody there to do registration. Usually it was one of us, but somebody would do registration, we get vitals, we find out, hey, what's going on, and then it's a matter of whether they went red, yellow, or green, or transferred out if we needed to. I worked on the night shift group. There was 12 of us on night shift. We gelled and just got along amazing and had a really good time. And we basically took a team-based approach with it, where on night shift we had the fortune to be able to kind of, we didn't necessarily have, okay, well, this is your tent, this is our tent. We basically just kind of worked together, and our clinicians actually, one of them has got about 28 years of fire and EMS in Northern Ohio, and she'd pop those back doors open, and she'd jump right back up in the truck, and it was just incredible to watch them be able to do those initial assessments and make those clinical decisions on, are we keeping them or are we not keeping them? We had a little kiddo that needed a digital lock, so we did a little bit of a procedural sedation with him to be able to, but we were able to keep the whole family together and didn't have to transfer him out because of the clinicians that we had with us. One of which I didn't realize, but with nurse practitioners, there's rules on what the age limits are on who they can take care of, whether they're family practitioner or adult practitioner. So we were fortunate on night shift. We had a family practitioner with us and a nurse practitioner with us to be able to hit pretty much the entire gamut of an age range for patients. Things that you still continue to learn. Our green tent is obviously, think of it as normal triage. Our green tent is going to be our little, basically our minors. Our yellows are going to be our mid-levels, and then our reds are going to be those that are critical patients. For us, it was pretty much stabilize and get them out. The last little arrow is our little octagon tent that was set up. That was our pharmacy. So our pharmacist, literally, the pharmacist was compounding medications on a level that most of them have not seen. There is no Pfizer rep. There's no one else there. It literally is the government sending you medication. And those pharmacists, I was beyond impressed at their ability. Being able to, one of them actually had to make lidocaine with epi to be able to use it for topical, and was doing the math, and it was just incredible. The other 5 tents that you see, 4 of those were where we slept, and then one of them was the command tent. The white vehicles were our support vehicles around us, and then we actually were fortunate to have U.S. Border Control agents, 2 from Washington State, and the other 22 were from the Texas area, from the southern border, and some of them were Borstar agents, but they literally were our perimeter control and our overwatch.
So what imaging capabilities do you have there?
So our imaging capabilities we have is somewhat rudimentary. Ironically, we do not have X-ray. We did not have X-ray capabilities, but we had ultrasound capability was one, and we had iStat, so we were able to do a handful of labs as well. Okay. So we could do finger sticks, ultrasound. We actually used ultrasound. We had a expectant mother, and it was kind of neat to be able to give her that reassurance when they were able to do the ultrasound, and for her to be able to see and realize that things were good. But yeah, somewhat rudimentary for where we were at, but radiology is one of the things that we did not have the capability of, which caused us to have to transfer out a handful of those patients just because we knew they were going to need imaging. This is one just looking some of the other pictures. Think outside the box. If the patients can't get to us, we're going out to the patients, and we actually had discussed who the strike teams would be if we needed to be able to send them out. I don't know about you guys, but I would love the idea to think that top right picture would be our little or let's go to the patient. Let's go to the patient today and see everybody, as opposed to the medics that most of us spend our time in. So, and the other one is looking at that middle picture. It's a family event, and you'll notice that the kids, they're all barefoot. Families, we're hitting them in a disaster. We're hitting them in their worst moments, and the families literally have, most of them have lost everything. So it's a matter of being able to meet them where they're at, and it's not just taking care of the patient. In a lot of cases, it's taking care of the entire family. Same thing with more than disasters. These are some of the COVID responses they've done. The ones actually moving dialysis patients out, and that is a military aircraft that they're bringing them out of, doing vaccinations. Some of the other things that we're seeing them do now is, on the next picture here, is location. The top right, they're at the Capitol, along with the other disaster deployments that we do with NVMS. Some of those things that we do is the Police Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C., so they're able to go in and they provide that support to what we call the NSSEs, the National Secret Service events. So a lot of times you may see us where we're providing preemptive medical care, similar to going to a concert and have an EMS tent set up. In that regards, they're sending us in for some of those events across the country. And then the tents, yes, those tents are set up in the snow on a football field. So it's one of those things so now we're going to take a look at just do a quick overview of some of the other things that we don't necessarily think of. I didn't want this to be the last slide. But DMORT, which is the Mortuary Response Team, as we know with disasters, there is a lot of times there is a death toll. So DMORT is actually the group of morticians. It is forensics. They ironically have X-ray capability, because what they want to be able to do is they need to look at the pacemakers, because when you're trying to identify people, what do we know that have identifying marks? We know that joints, artificial replacements, our knees, our hips and knees have numbers on them to be able to track back to who the patient is. Our pacemakers, dentures. So it's kind of interesting when we did our deployment deployment with the summit, was to be able to spend time with the mortuary team as far as how they're able to sometimes come back and identify fingerprints and things. And also, fun fact with the DMORT is any commercial air travel or commercial travel, mass fatality, DMORT is the contracted agency that's going to do those responses. So not only are they doing the responses that we all may be doing, they're doing those bus crashes, plane crashes. They're automatically the team that gets pulled, and there's only I believe there's 5 of them across the country. So that's a busy group of people. And the other end too is we can't forget our fluffies and scruffies, and occasionally the law enforcement horse. So the National Veterinary Response has a team similarly as well, where they're trained and they actually can do surgeries. It's quite impressive at what their response is. Imagine going into an area where farming, that cattle is the residents' livelihoods. So we want to make sure that we're able to help take care of them, and then anything else that we may need with them. Finally, we have reached our closing slide. This was our DMAT, and NDMS usually does a challenge coin for each of the deployments. This one I thought was pretty interesting, one, because it was my first one, and also they were able to capture the hurricane as a Cat 5. That is a replica of satellite imagery of the Cat 5 with the time when it hit landfall, and then the other one is the Cat 1 that hit a few days later back on the coast of where it made landfall on both of them. And then the backside shows all the different agencies. That is very small print, but literally shows the dozens and dozens of agencies from across the U.S. that were sent, from anything from the incident management team to logistics to us on the ground. So it's one of those things where there's a spot for everybody. There's a spot for everybody with the team as far as what you want to be able to do and what your niche is.
So I have one last question. Maybe I should have asked it at the beginning. So what is the difference between Ohio DMAT and Ohio Task Force 1? And do you work together, particularly if Task Force 1 is based out of Dayton, as is one of the DMAT teams?
So that's a great question. And they are, to say, same but different. So a lot of us are all familiar, and I know for me, I was way more familiar with Task Force, with those kinds of deployments, than I was with the NDMS and the DMAT. Through family experiences, I knew a lot more about DMORT before I knew about any of the others. But with Task Force 1, they're deployed more on their federal deployment, but their federal deployment is coming from the Homeland Security. They're coming more from the FEMA side of things, where NDMS is coming from Health and Human Services. When we were actually in Florida, circumstances didn't lead for me to be able to have that interaction, but we actually came across some of Task Force Ohio Task Force 1 was in Florida. They were finishing up about the same time we were getting there. One thing with Task Force is they're going in more for that search and rescue. So they're going in either right on the heels of it, helping to find those patients. And NDMS, a lot of times, we're the ones coming in on the after side of it to be able to help when the infrastructure still hasn't come back up. So
Task Force extricates, DMAT treats.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And occasionally there may be some overlap where they may go in with them to be able to do those treats, like the ones where you see them like with a helicopter where they're sending a strike team out of DMAT personnel. So yes, so they occasionally can work together, but they're just deployed from 2 different branches of the federal government.
All right. Thank you. So that was a great talk. I'm sure that if somebody has an interest in participating in DMAT, that Ginger knows how to connect them.
Yes, absolutely.
So if you have an interest, reach out to Ginger at West Licking. Otherwise, that concludes our MEC Minute. Thank you for listening in. And again, Ginger, thank you for helping with us.
Thank you for having me.